Well, here I am again this Sunday in lockdown in a church building. It'll be fantastic when we're back in our buildings, when they're open for prayer and sooner or later for congregations to meet. We don't know when that will be, but it'll be so great to be back together again, meeting, perhaps socially distant still, but at least meeting and seeing faces of people that we know and love. So today, my theme is that the Church of Jesus in this corona time has a number of priorities. Worship, of course, sometimes by Zoom, mission in a variety of ways, but also a prophetic voice, particularly on behalf of the poor. That's the theme today. I was reminded recently of the opening line of Charles Dickens' novel, A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And actually in Corona, before we read this verse about Jesus' care for the poor and the needy, in Corona there's some really good things to celebrate. And I think we ought to do that uninhibitedly and get the celebration going. It's a really brilliant thing that pollution is down all over the world. People can breathe a bit more easily. Thank God for clearer skies and for fresh air. And also, of course, crime here in the UK down by about 25%. Road traffic accidents down, pretty obviously, with so much less traffic about. Some families talk about how isolating together, they've sat down at a table and eaten meals as a family for the first time for months or even years. They've got to know their husband or wife or partner better. So there are enormous positives in some of this, and we ought to thank God for it. I myself, who could hardly be described as a big nature lover, have actually noticed spring arrive and to see some of the beauty of God's creation. Here in the UK, I don't know where you are in the world and what your weather's been like. Here in the UK, it's been 2 months of amazing weather. So we've been able to get out. One of the saving graces of lockdown has been outdoor time, if you have that space, of course, is beautiful. And we've been able to see God's creation. So there are some positives that we can celebrate and take note of. But for some, it is the worst of times, and that's those people particularly who are poor. Now, when the Bible talks about poor, it doesn't just mean those with limited amounts of cash, although that might be included. It means those who don't have access to the levers of power, those who can't make stuff happen because they don't quite know how to access things or to get things done. So poor often does mean the absence of material resources, but it's far wider than that. Here's what Jesus says in Luke's Gospel, Luke chapter 4, about his concern for the neediest in society. The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He sent me, and here's a list, to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, release for the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. This is Jesus in Nazareth, getting his ministry off to a start, defining himself as on the side of the broken and the sad. In this way, Jesus is simply fulfilling the kind of prophetic tradition of the Old Testament and indeed the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. Here's some writing in the book of Proverbs, a collection of sayings from Solomon and others, about how to act. Jesus is the embodiment, actually, of this teaching. Here it is in Proverbs 31. Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. In some of the translations, be a voice for the voiceless. And then it goes on to say, for the rights of all who are destitute, speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and the needy. So it's clear from the Old and the New Testament that there is a priority for followers of this God to be on the side of and caring for people who are broken and sad and in difficulties, or to use the overarching code word, the poor. Generally speaking, the NHS has got lots of advocates at the moment. Every main political party, everybody's on the side of the NHS. There are plenty of voices speaking up for our healthcare system. The trade unions are speaking up for train drivers and teachers and others. But there seem to be not just a generic category of poor that are voiceless and people aren't speaking up for them, but a subset of that. And I want to speak briefly about children and young people, because lockdown is disproportionately damaging our children and young people and their future, particularly in the global family, about which we should have deep concern. 20 million children, it's estimated, will die in the next 10 years, extra deaths, because of lockdown. Children around the world are being sexually and physically abused in vast numbers, not least in the developing countries. In educational terms, here in Britain, the gap between rich and poor is often seen in educational contexts. In a recent survey, teachers were asked about whether what percentage of pupils they were teaching remotely had submitted 3/4 of their projects and were therefore learning. In poor areas, 8% of students were handing in at least 3/4 of their work. In rich middle-class areas, 50% were handing in their work. And so the gap between a poor child and a wealthy family child is vast, and that gap is growing. And the longer schools stay closed, whatever the safety issues are, the longer that happens, the more the life chances of the poorest children in our country are being deeply damaged. And not only that, as they get a bit older, the life chances and the chance of an employment for someone who's in their teenage years. What kind of jobs do you think there are going to be available to have from this autumn onwards, when unemployment runs riot through our country and indeed through Western democracies? What jobs will there be for our teenagers to get? What kind of start in life will it be for them, so many of them unable to find gainful employment? And so we know that children and young people are disproportionately affected, particularly those from poorer families. And the church should be screaming loudly about this. Children matter to God, and they should matter to us. And the wider group of the poor, these children who fit into that wider group. Of course, children want to be safe when they go back to school, and teachers want to be safe. And we should take those concerns seriously and respect them. But we have to understand the costs of not going back to school. David Spielhager, the statistician, says the chances of a child dying of coronavirus is 1 in 5.3 million. Now, if that's a risk you're not prepared to take, sending your child back to school, you're probably going to have to homeschool your children forever. That's a pretty low risk. And the incidence of child-to-adult transmission, in other words, the danger for the teacher of being with children, is really very, very difficult to define. But whatever it is, it's very, very low. Maybe there are no cases of it, but it's certainly difficult to define. And strangely, when this thing began, even the chief medical officer was saying the reason we haven't closed schools already is because there's very little scientific evidence that closing the schools makes a big difference. So, of course, if you've been listening to any of these broadcasts, you know I'm risk-embracing rather than risk-averse. And I know that if we're going to care for poorer children and poorer families, we need to get them back into school, or their life chances will be deeply, deeply threatened. And what about the wider question of the poor in the world? We do know that in the last 20 years, global absolute poverty has been halved. And we know already, with 3 months of this lockdown around the world, that almost all of that gain has been lost. And the evidence appears to be that 100 million people will be thrown back into absolute poverty because of this. That means not just an economic figure, but the poor will die in greater numbers, and their life chances will be severely, horribly minimised. You may not know this, but $500 billion a year is sent back to the developing world from people who've come from families, usually a man in the family, not always, and has gone back. They go and work in America or Australia or Canada or the UK, and they earn money and they send it back to their families. Most of those people now in the last 3 months, because they're not essential workers particularly, most of them in the hospitality business, have sent no money back to their families. Those families have got no income, $500 billion worth of no income. They're not being cared for in some social security system, and that figure is greater than all the aid we send to these countries. The hidden costs of this lockdown are immense. Now you might say, well, yes, okay, but still we want to keep our people safe and so on, and we know that. But if we're going to be God's women and men, allowing, if we must, for the reality of lockdown, surely at the same time we should be screaming from the hilltops. Church leaders should be shouting about this. We should be writing to our members of parliament. We'll be saying, in all this, never forget, this thing must not go on a day longer than it needs to, because every day that passes, poorer people will be deeply damaged in all of this. We know that there will be a mental health tsunami of cases when this thing comes to an end. We know full well that as tax receipts fall in Britain and around the world, there won't be enough money or very little to care for those services which people need, all of us. Rich people will find a way to pay for their health care. Poorer people will have no access because the services, there'll be no money to provide them. People will be immensely poorer. This is not an economic argument, it's a health argument. And the Bible's consistently encouraging us to cry out to God on behalf of the poor, of whom there will be an increasing number in the West and indeed around the world. And so today, as we look at this passage in Luke and then in Proverbs, and we see the biblical emphasis on the poor, pray for our governments to see and to weigh not just the safety aspects of care, but to balance that with a desperate, urgent need to stop this thing where it can be, so that the poor suffer less and less and less. A week or so ago, I quoted Thucydides in these talks, this great sad quote where he says, "The rich do what they can and the weak suffer what they must." A kind of abandonment of hope. Look, it's always the way it's been. The poor are just going to suffer. That's the way it is. And my prayer today is that we'll be so inspired by the biblical revelation of hope for the future that we'll make sure our governments, acting carefully if they must, also day by day recognise that every 24 hours that passes, without an easing of these things, a growth in the economy, a care for the most vulnerable, will be wreaking years of havoc in our world. And so it's our job, isn't it, prophetically, to cry out on behalf of the most broken and the most needy, the saddest, the hurting, those who have no voice, to be the voice for them in this world. So today, on this Sunday, take a moment to pray for our leaders, that God will give them both wisdom and courage to take bold steps, weighing up not just the corona issue, but the wider global issues of the impact of corona on our neediest and most vulnerable families. May God make us not just those who agitate on behalf of the poor, but those who model in our lives generosity and hope and practical action on their behalf, both now and in the weeks and months to come, as this need rolls out over the rest of 2020 and possibly beyond. God grant us that passion, that wisdom and that courage. In Jesus' name, amen.